This episode of the Rewilding Earth podcast sponsored in part by Strix occidentalis carina, the northern spotted owl. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. Chad Hanson co-founded the John Muir Project in 1996. He first became involved in national forest protection after hiking the 2,700-mile Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada with his older brother in 1989. During this hike, he witnessed firsthand the devastation caused by rampant commercial logging on our national forests in California, Oregon, and Washington. He's the author of Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. Today we start where Chad decided to start his conservation work, on the PCT in 1989.
I started backpacking when I was a kid, about 11 years old. And so I had been backpacking for a number of years before my older brother and I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail in 1989. At that time, I was 22. And all my backpacking, really up until that point was in protected landscapes. It was in national parks. It was in wilderness areas, almost all of it. And so I really didn't understand the distinction between protected public lands and public lands that are not protected, public lands that are open to logging, like national forests. And my brother and I figured that out the hard way as we hiked further north on the Pacific Crest Trail. We hiked the whole thing in 1989. And we, in the northern Sierra Nevada, we began to see all these signs saying, Forest Service signs saying, trail washed out, take detour. And we kept following the signs and was adding miles and taking us away from water sources and became a source of frustration. And then one day we came across two gentlemen who were standing next to one of these signs and writing something on it. And they saw us and they hiked quickly up ahead of us, up the trail away from us. And they had written on the sign as we got up there, clear cuts ahead, it's a scam. And so this is the first time we ignored the sign and hiked ahead. And then within a short period of time, we realized that that it had nothing to do with the trail being washed out. That was just a ruse, so the Forest Service could do its commercial logging program and hide the effects of it from the public. And of course, we hiked through this massive clear cut. It was just nothing but stumps all the way up to the ridgeline. So we hiked on ahead and caught up with these two guys, and they were Forest Service employees whose job it was to put up the signs. And so we ended up hiking with these guys for some period of time, and they were really cool. We got a great education from them about the difference between national parks and national forests, and the fact that the main thing the U.S. Forest Service does is sell public timber to private logging companies and keep the revenue. And already by that time, the Forest Service was trying to find more creative ways to justify their logging program, and all the euphemisms were starting already by then. Before they would just call it logging, and they started calling it fuel reduction and restoration and forest health and other things, just to because these things sound benign or benevolent, and a lot of people continue to be confused by that. But that's when I got involved in forest protection. We got to Canada, and as soon as we got back down to Southern California, where we were living at that time, I got involved, and I've been involved ever since.
What's it like to be a conservationist for that long, working on these issues and watching very closely, closer than most people do, giant areas just being attacked all the time? Some of your favorite areas. What's the secret to your longevity in this so-called business of conservation?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks. I have two very diametrically opposed reactions and responses that I'm always sort of grappling with at any given point in time. But as far as my longevity, and to me, it's really driven by my love of wild places and my endless fascination with ecology, forest ecology, fire ecology, the intricacy, the complexity, the beauty of the relationships in nature that reflect evolutionary processes that go back over 350 million years. I'm just absolutely in love with the natural world, always have been. And so to me, that fundamentally is what drives me. I will say that when I see places that I know, places that I love, when I see them get logged, when I see roads punched through, when I see them destroyed by various types of commodity extraction, including logging or mining, oil and gas exploration, it's hard. I mean, it really is. I have a personal reaction to it. I have no problem acknowledging that. I mourn the loss of these places. I do. And I always have, because, first and foremost, I'm a field ecologist. I'm a boots on the ground guy. I spend thousands and thousands of hours in these places, and I know many of them very, very well, right down to the individual tree, right down to the shrub, the down log, the snag. I know areas on a personal level. I know the woodpeckers that live in a certain cavity and where they were living the previous spring. Things like that, that you accumulate that kind of familiarity when you spend a lot of time in places and just sitting and observing and watching. And so it's really hard personally when you see places lost. I will say, though, on the other side, I also know places that back in the late 80s, in 1989 or in the early 90s, had been fairly recently damaged and destroyed by logging operations and had been converted to monoculture tree plantations. And in the northern Sierra Nevada and the Cascades and the Marble Mountains. And it's interesting because so many of those places, I visited them later in many cases, and nature has essentially reclaimed those areas in so many cases. These tree plantations don't stay ecologically sterile and monoculture over time. Nature rewilds them just through the sheer force of natural processes and the passage of time. Pockets of trees die. Now you have snags and down logs. Species they didn't plant and didn't want because they're not favored timber species start to grow in as the wind blows the seeds in, or birds and small mammals disperse the seeds in. Shrubs grow in that they didn't want. Natural heterogeneity takes place. And basically nature forms these places back into mature and diverse and frankly wild ecosystems once again, just through the lack of human intervention. And so for me, that gives me a lot of hope.
You say something in chapter 1 of your book that's, a lot of us read a lot of news, see a lot of news, and at the end of a day where you've been hit with too much, it's kind of hard to find the hope in our current situation. You said something pretty amazing. Can you talk about how much protecting and restoring native forests could help with the climate change mitigation? I was kind of surprised by how much you stated that it could help.
I think this is something that we need to get the word out on nationally and globally. Policymakers need to hear this. Environmental reporters need to hear this. Conservation NGOs need to hear this, that we absolutely can overcome the climate crisis. So there is hope. We've already seen impacts. We're going to see more impacts because some of this is already, of course, already happening, but we can avoid the worst impacts. We absolutely can of the climate crisis, but it's going to take two things, not one. A lot of people realize, of course, nearly everyone at this point who pays attention realizes that we have to shift away from fossil fuel consumption as quickly as possible. Okay, that's well understood at this point. What a lot of people don't understand is that that is not enough. That's necessary, it's not sufficient, that up to 50%, and possibly even more than 50%, of the climate change mitigation equation can be addressed with what we call natural climate solutions, and most especially protecting forests in order to mitigate the climate crisis. That can be half of our climate change mitigation approach. And the reason is simple, is that because of many decades of logging in forests all across this country and all over the world, the vast majority of our forests have far less carbon in them than they did a century ago, 2 centuries ago. And that means there's massive climate change mitigation potential for protecting wild places, forests especially, but not just forests, also wetlands, also grasslands and chaparral habitat, anything that can store more carbon, especially including where there's been degradation in the past. And also, of course, the places that have not been degraded, because those are amazing carbon sinks and carbon reserves. But I think it's important to realize, number one, that protecting wild places, and especially forests, is just as important to get us out of this mess, this climate mess, as getting away from fossil fuels. It is just as important, and it needs to be done simultaneously, not sequentially. And second, that it's not just about protecting the places that are relatively few now, that have not had past resource extraction or management. So the wild places that have not had logging or road building. It's incredibly important to protect those, but it's also important to protect the places that have had a history of impacts and degradation from past resource extraction, including logging, because those places can absorb a lot more carbon and become more wild, more biodiverse, more carbon rich over time.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. From humble beginnings to global conservation phenomenon, the rewilding movement continues to grow and thrive amid the greatest ecological challenges our planet has faced in 65 million years. Here's how you can join us and help return balance to nature. First, go to rewilding.org and subscribe to the weekly digest to keep up on the latest rewilding news, interviews, and art. Second, consider donating to support the Rewilding Institute's mission to rewild North America and beyond. And for extra credit, please like, subscribe, and share this podcast to help spread the word. Thanks so much for your support.
That commercial exploitation thing with the Forest Service really bugged me all the way back when you were talking about it, and you just discovered it in the late 80s, early 90s. Has any of that changed? Have they just changed the name, what they call it? I mean, the Forest Service can't self-deal today, surely, like it did back then.
Yeah, it's really, really important question. And thank you, by the way, for noticing, just the way I wrote my book, Smokescreen. I really did. I wrote it for non-scientists, fundamentally. Of course, I've got hundreds of scientific studies cited in the endnotes. But I really wanted to translate the science and also, translate it through personal experiences and anecdotes for a broader public, and also just underscore the hopeful nature, what I believe is a fundamentally hopeful nature of the science that's emerging, because it does give us a roadmap. It gives us a hopeful, positive path forward if we pay attention and follow it. And that really dovetails with your next question, which is, has the Forest Service changed? And I think this is one of the messages I come back to in my book. I make this point in chapter 1, but I also make it throughout throughout Smokescreen, which is there is a hopeful path forward, and in order to follow it, we're going to have to make some changes, and we're also going to have to confront some powerful institutions. We're going to have to confront politicians, both Republicans and Democrats. We're going to have to hold them accountable. We're going to have to insist on more, demand better. And the same thing is true of agencies like the U.S. Forest Service. And, as I mentioned, the Forest Service is not monolithic. There's a lot of good people in the Forest Service. There really are. And that's true today. It was true in 1989. The problem is the laws under which the Forest Service under which the Forest Service operates. And those laws allow the Forest Service and encourage the Forest Service to sell public trees to private logging companies and keep the revenue. It allows and encourages the Forest Service to be in the commercial logging business, like a giant logging corporation. And taxpayers are subsidizing that every single year. And so that's the problem, is that it forces good people to behave badly. And that's as true today in 2022 as it was in 1989. It was as true in 1989 as it was in 1969. And until that changes, we're going to continue to see problems with the Forest Service. The Forest Service will continue to prioritize commercial logging over other activities because they make money doing it, not just from the timber sales, but also from the congressional appropriations to support the timber sales program. Because, of course, a lot of members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, get a lot of campaign contributions from the logging industry. And accordingly, they appropriate large sums of money to the Forest Service to prioritize commercial logging. And so it goes. And so over the years, a number of deceptive euphemisms have basically been created by the Forest Service to hide the true nature of what they're doing. Forest health, fuel reduction, forest resilience, fire management, you name it. There's a number of different euphemisms. Restoration, that's another one that comes up a lot. And these are all basically things that describe commercial logging. The commercial logging is really fundamentally the same as it was in the 1980s. These terms are used to promote clear cuts after fires, post-fire clear cutting, which is incredibly destructive ecologically. It's being used to promote clear cuts of old growth forest and roadless areas. It's being used to log mature and old growth trees in so-called commercial thinning operations. Thinning, by the way, is another one of these euphemisms. And so the logging program has not fundamentally changed. It's fundamentally the same as it was decades ago. The levels fluctuate. The main thing that's changed is that there's just less logging now than there was in the 1980s, thankfully, because a lot of people in the general public and media and politicians got wise to what the Forest Service was doing and started expressing more concern and skepticism. And the concern, though, is that logging levels have started to creep up again. And that's really, I think, what we need to confront. And we really need a renewed and more vigorous conversation about ending the logging program on national forests, basically getting the U.S. Forest Service out of the commercial logging business and bringing them into the 21st century.
At least one of the most extreme examples of what you're talking about is the Tongass that I can think of. And I was just watching a documentary not too long ago called Understory. And I was struck. I know I've seen the historic range, the full breadth from north to south of the Tongass forest before we started logging, but it had been a long time, and they showed it in the documentary, and it just sent chills. And it reaffirmed my stance that they're never, ever going to stop on their own. You being on the track of this for so long, what is that really going to look like? What is that going to take that, because we have done individual campaigns that have been successful, but none of them have changed how the Forest Service looks at its position in general. It's still doing the same kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. The Forest Service will never change on its own because the laws that govern the Forest Service essentially dictate its policies. And so the onus is on Congress and us as members of the public to put pressure on members of Congress, especially those who claim they care about the climate crisis, those who claim they care about the extinction crisis, those who promote things like 30 by 30, protecting 30% of wildlands by 2030 and 50 by 50, 50% by 2050. Those who are making those statements, including the Biden administration, including progressives in Congress, they need to step up. They need to show leadership. And because we're going to have to actually change the laws and change the policies to get the Forest Service out of the logging business, because you're right, it will never change on its own as long as those laws and regulations are in place. I think what's different now, and I think this is another reason why I'm hopeful, is that back in the late 80s and into the 1990s, there were so many different movements that were balkanized, that were doing their own thing separately, almost like in a vacuum. But they weren't really communicating. So there were biodiversity activists, working to try to protect the northern spotted owl in the Pacific Northwest from logging operations, working to protect the Pacific fisher in the southern Sierra Nevada from logging and other species in other parts of the country. And there were environmental justice activists in environmental justice movement that was growing and building, that was focused on the impacts of various types of commercial resource extraction and commodity production in terms of the impacts on communities, especially communities that were already overly burdened and disproportionately impacted. And I think there wasn't much communication between those two worlds. I think that's changed a lot. I think we realize that there are profound and profoundly important connections and intersections between movements, and that we can work together. We must work together. We are much stronger together. This is one of the examples I use in my book, Smokescreen. The wood pellet industry and the forest biomass industry, both in the East and the West. And the industry is destroying forests. It's harming biodiversity. It is a huge source of carbon emissions because basically the industry is burning trees and portions of trees for energy production, like trees or sticks of coal. As I mentioned in the book, burning trees for energy is even worse than coal as an energy source, which is really hard to do. It produces even more CO2 per unit of energy produced. And in addition, this industry, both in the East and the West, is disproportionately impacting lower income communities and communities of color, and primarily Black communities in the Southeast, and in the Northeast, primarily Latino and Native American communities in the West. And these communities are being impacted and burdened by chronic particulate and toxic pollution from this industry, which is disproportionately siting and locating its biomass and wood pellet plants in underserved communities. So there are intersections that are active now and developing and growing. And I think that between environmental justice, climate justice organizations, biodiversity organizations, working together actively in ways that simply didn't exist 20 or 25 years ago. That gives me a lot of hope.
How can we help with through the John Muir Project? And everybody listening can go to johnmuirproject.org to find out more. But what would you have us do to take action and get involved?
Yeah, thanks. Well, certainly we have a lot of information on the John Muir Project's website, www.johnmuirproject.org. There's a lot of information in my book, Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. And of course, people can get the information in the background there. But what it really comes down to is action and people getting involved and getting activated. It's really important, I think, for people to realize that environmental organizations, conservation organizations, scientific research organizations, we can provide information, we can be a catalyst, but we need help. We all need help. We all need people, everyone, to get involved and contact their members of Congress, contact your state legislators, write letters to the editor, do all the things, organize, local monthly or bi-monthly letter writing meetings, to send emails and letters or text messages to elected officials, both state and federal, to write letters to the editor, local papers. Any way you can communicate with them. Social media posts is a big one. And we do a lot of that as well at John Muir Project, and we can certainly give people advice and tips, and we're always happy to do that and pass along information. And that's really what we need, because we need champions in Congress. We need members, a certain number of members of good faith, some real progressives to stand up and actually confront these problems and promote policies that will fundamentally change direction.
Do you have a favorite example of what you're talking about, at least on a regional or a local level, where people came together and did something you were kind of surprised succeeded anytime in your career?
Sure. Yeah, there are countless. There are many. I look at things right now like the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which is this big, bold wilderness bill. It's been around for a long time. It's evolved somewhat over the years. It's is good or better now than it's ever been. We protect over 20 million acres of wilderness on public lands in the Northern Rockies ecosystem. I look at that, and this was something that came together from biodiversity organizations, and now, of course, we all realize there's a climate change benefit, climate change mitigation benefit to protecting these wild places. And so I think the coalition is broadened. It's gaining traction in Congress, in both the House and the Senate. And so I think that we can push and must push big, bold wilderness bills like that, not just in the Northern Rockies, but elsewhere as well. And I think that's another thing that people can do, is contact their members of Congress, their U.S. senators, and their congressional representative, and make sure they're co-sponsoring the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act. I look at things like what's happening in in a number of different efforts to stop some logging projects. There's a logging project that the Forest Service is proposing on Pine Mountain in the Los Padres National Forest. A large portion of it is in an inventoried roadless area. This is mature and old forest, a lot of it old growth forest, primary forest. It's a Native American sacred site. It has incredibly high biodiversity value. There's California condor roost sites there, California spotted owl nest sites. And the Forest Service is proposing this big commercial logging project in this area. And there's been this incredibly active coalition, Native American groups and activists, mostly Chumash biodiversity groups led by Los Padres Forest Watch. John Muir Project is part of that as well. And California Chaparral Institute, Center for Biological Diversity, and others. And there's just been this tremendous outpouring of public support for protecting this area and in opposition to the logging. The county has gotten involved in opposing the logging project. Cities in the area are opposing the logging project. Forest Service is still, proceeding with it. It'll probably end up in court, but the point is that we're seeing types and levels and breadth and diversity of opposition now that we just simply didn't see 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. And again, that just really gives me hope, seeing these broad, diverse, powerful coalitions come together to push for change.
Chad, I really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you for talking with me. And really, I love talking about these issues and love talking about the path forward, because again, I really am hopeful, probably more now than ever, because again of the depth and breadth of communities coming together and working together, standing shoulder to shoulder to push for change.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. We do what we do because of you. This podcast is supported by listeners like you who long to live in a wilder world. Please consider donating at rewilding.org and subscribe to our weekly news and article digest while you're there. To go the extra mile, you can follow and share Rewilding Earth on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Bonus points for sharing this podcast with your friends. To listen to past episodes, go to rewilding.org/pod. That's rewilding.org/pod.